Okay, so I'm going to send you off to your teams so you can continue the work you were doing on Fridays. By the way, I figured out why you could not adjust the columns for those of you last week. So I went through and adjusted them. Apparently, I have everything on lockdown. So I don't know why it expands the way it does during lockdown. It's not supposed to. I submitted a ticket to the software folks. The only way you can adjust it is if I unlock it, then we can adjust it back to the appropriate size. So I'm going to leave it in the lock position because I don't want you moving everything around because it starts to move everything around. So if it gets, if it starts to get wide again, I'll go ahead and make I'll do the adjustment. Just let me know and I'll make the adjustment. So I went through and adjusted everyone's early this morning. And again, they don't know why that's happening, but that's a bug in the software. So, all right. So you guys ready? All right, 30 minutes. Here we go. All right. Okay, so is everyone here that needs to be here?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay. All right. So go ahead and explain what you did last week, and then you guys can continue. I'll sit in for a little bit in case you have any questions, and like I said, just get as far as you can on this.
Hey, Jess, my breakout room didn't open.
Your breakout. Okay, hang on for a second. Let me see. Why is that?
Yeah, mine didn't either.
You sure? It looks like interesting. Wow. I don't know where you guys are at. All right, hang on for a second. Let me see. Let me go back to the main. Okay, I just sent it again.
Oh, there we go. Okay, now we got it.
Okay.
All right, we're in. Hey, Eric.
Yes.
All right, so where are we at on this?
Creating our Gantt chart. But while I was working on it Friday, we noticed we still didn't have a very detailed breakdown yet of what
Okay, what do we need to break down?
So Eric, let me jump in. Let me jump in here. So what you guys are doing, basically you're copying over. We're creating now the Gantt chart, which is on the far right, which we started to do that. Eric and I started to do that on Friday. You're going to look at your Post-it notes here and determine the sequence. And then what you're going to do is every one of those columns is basically 5 working days. And if you go to week 1, right, week 1, so in week 1, basically we identified, here's the first thing you need to do is define the scope, establish the scope of work. That includes, you need to work on the mechanical engineering because that's going to provide input into the scope of work. The electrical engineering needs to be worked on because that's going to add in that, you had 1 week, which is 5 days. So the start day was today, the 15th. Today's the 15th, so it's Tuesday, which means you only have 4 days, 4 days last week and 1 day this week, right? or sorry,
Right.
4 days this week, the rest of this week. And so that would mean next Tuesday, you would start the next activity, which is to assign responsibility, right? So basically what you do is you got to add the number of dates, and assign responsibility's got 5 days. So that's next Tuesday. So the Tuesday after that is when you can start working on establishing the timeline based on the sequence of work that you have. And so, but these others like personal safety, personnel safety, product safety, all that is happening inside. Those are all inputs into scope of work. So all that work is happening inside the 5 days, between the two major tasks. And then, estimating costs. Estimating costs has 8-week duration. So that's why it starts. And I think that was that's the question I think that Eric and I were asking is, what is the breakdown? What does that mean? Should that be broken down a little bit further? Are you getting an estimated cost first, and then you're getting more defined cost, and then you're going to have your final cost, which means you're going to have to break that into smaller tasks. The other thing along with that we didn't see in your work breakdown structure that's missing just early is once you define your scope, when are you going to buy the material that you need? Because in your work breakdown structure, you have the material. It doesn't show where you actually buy the material. You have in there, let's see, order. It says order a machine, but what about all the other material?
Oh, okay, like the spouting stuff and
Yep.
all that's been ordered already for the whole project,
Okay.
and same with the electrical wire and stuff.
Okay, so I would put a box there anyway, right?
Okay.
All those things just to show that those things, again, remember, we're simulating saying that the project's starting September 14th or September 15th. In reality, you've already started some of that, but you should include the stuff you've already done.
Yeah.
Like you have, that's what it was. We were looking at, you had estimating supply cost. What does that mean? But where do you order that? It doesn't show where that gets ordered.
Right. Okay.
So you're not talking about the vendor specific, you're talking about the action.
Well, yeah, what materials are you responsible for? Not with the supplier. If part of their scope is to buy material for the work that they're performing, that's up to them. But if you are buying material yourselves, that's got to show up someplace on here.
Yeah, because we did buy material. They used material.
Okay, so that was one of the questions that popped up. So to Eric's point, some of the details were missing as to where was that piece. There was a piece of it, the estimating piece, but okay, what about the acquisition of that stuff? And then
We should already have a cost on that because I think Eric's the one that ordered the supplies for the spouting, and then we got flanges ordered.
okay,
And
you
then,
just need to show a task that I know that you guys have already done it, but you just need to plot it where you think it should be, probably in the planning phase, I would presume, right? Or
yeah,
right after
'cause
that.
yes, right after that would be the initial start of that. Because
And
you
then
want to
the
have
oth-
it here before the project starts.
Right. Then the other thing in here you had is get quotes from contractors, but where do you actually execute the contract?
That'd be during the planning stages.
Okay.
We'd have quotes and stuff before we commit to starting this project.
Right. That's you have that in your work breakdown structure, but you don't have where you actually place the contract.
Okay.
I mean, those are the things that it went from quoting contract and then schedule the contractor, but where do you actually sign? Where do you actually issue an order?
That'd be in the planning stages because we did review the three quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so we could put that in there.
Okay. All I'm saying, go through that, and you may have to add things. Everyone else had to do the same thing, so they quickly discovered they had to break some of those Post-it notes apart just to make them so you can actually put a schedule together. And that's the purpose of doing this exercise, because you're going to find in here that, yeah, you have this big box or this Post-it note that covers a lot of stuff, but in order to schedule it, those things inside that box happens multiple places, and you need
Yeah.
to break that out.
Okay.
All right. So once you
All
guys
right.
do that, and I'll jump back here, I'll make my rounds and come back and spend some time with you guys.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks.
Okay, so I mean, I guess since we're so far behind, what we should probably do is put the big block things, like, so like the first one there, establish scope of work, assign responsibility. If we move the big blocks into,
So how are you guys doing?
Oh, pretty good. We're just getting our final stuff in there, and then we're starting to put in roll up the costs.
Okay.
I've got to jump off real quick and take this call.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right, Susie, it's all on you.
Uh-oh. Hmm. So when we do the weekly totals, we need to, so so say like solidify the scope, the duration we put was 3 weeks, but a total of 16 hours. Would we split up that cost we calculated?
Yep. So you
Okay.
would basically take the 16 hours, right? So it's
Uh-huh.
15 and divided by 15. So every day it's a little bit of, right? So it's 16 hours divided by 15 days, 3 weeks,
Okay.
right? And that's an
Right.
hour, that's a little more than an hour a day. So you look at the hour per day, right? So let's say the first, we're starting on Tuesday. So the most you can get is 4 days, 4 days times 4.16 or something, whatever the calculation turns out to be. And that's how many hours you would actually consume, right? It's consume, right?
Mhm.
Mathematically, right? If the person only has that amount available, so you would consume 4+ hours in that
Okay.
week. And what I would do is put, yeah, so you got your weekly total there, and that's what should be in your weekly total.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
Again, that's from a calculation. Now, reality may be completely different. Maybe on the last day, the last 2 days, you spend all 16. But again, this is to help two things. Help the project manager to understand how he should be consuming, he or she should be consuming their hours, right? And if they're not
Mhm.
consuming the hours, that individual needs to explain why, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the reality is you rarely have people for 2 full days to do any real work if they're being shared, right? So there has to be some hours being consumed. And so part of what we're going to talk about today is performance indicators. And that's one of those performance indicators we should be watching, right? If we're not consuming effort hours and we're not consuming the budget, or we're consuming the budget too fast and yet the duration, we still have a long time. I mean, we got to start asking a lot of questions.
Okay.
Okay. But that's how you
Okay.
would calculate it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to go check on team 2.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you in a bit.
Okay.
Well, how are we doing?
I'm just cleaning up the maths a little bit.
Is there anything else we were supposed to do after rolling up the hours and the dollars each week?
Nope. The hours and dollars per week is what's important. Did your hours match what your estimate was?
We were actually, you mean from the WBS?
Yep.
We actually were under. We had a couple of stickies that we pulled out when we were
Okay.
creating the schedule because they were duplicate. So.
And how are you consuming your hours?
What do you mean?
So for example, I'm going to go to let me share a screen. So I'm going to your very first step, 1.1.3, 1 week, 20 hours. Remember I said starting date is what, the 15th, which means there's only 4 working days this week, but you have 5 days to complete the work, which means from a budgetary of those 20 hours and 5, that means 4 hours a day, right? So if we take 5 days divided by, or take the 20 hours divided by 5 days, you're consuming 4 hours a day, which means the most you can consume in week 1 is 16 hours. And that is what should be reflected in your budget, because next Monday you would consume the last 4 hours. So 4 hours, so 4 hours should be in next week's dollar amount.
Got it. So we have 4 days and 20 hours. Go over that again. Sorry.
So right now you're saying your duration is 5 days, 1 week,
Yeah.
right?
But there's
So-
like 4 days in that week, right?
Right. So you have a total of 20 hours over 5 days. The easiest calculation is take 20 divided by 5, right? How many hours are you consuming per day? And so you're consuming 4 hours a day, but you only have 4 working days you'll be working on it this week. That means you're only consuming 16 of the 20 hours this week. And then on Monday, you consume the other 4 hours.
Got it. Okay.
So
That
you
makes
need to look at that from a budgetary perspective. Now, reality may be something completely different, right? But from a plan perspective and a budgetary perspective, this is how you would establish your budget that you would be measuring against, right? It would be based on the consumption of those hours on a daily basis.
Got it.
Because what would happen is if you punch it into the software, that's all the software's going to do. It's just going to look at the number of days and the number of hours and just take the total hours and divide it by the number of total days of the duration. And that's how it calculates the budget.
Makes sense.
Okay. So I would like you guys, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, that the system, so all we're doing is mimicking the system. The reality may be that your 20 hours get spent on Thursday, Friday, and Monday. Okay, it's the hockey stick, right? Nothing happens at the beginning, but that's where you consume. But from a project manager perspective, if I'm using the dollars to manage my progress, if I'm not consuming, because one of the numbers I need to look at are the 3 numbers I need to look at: duration, percent completed duration, percent complete of effort hours, and percent complete of the budget. And then we'll talk about that later today, because that's one of the key performance indicators we need to look at, why we have to look at all 3, because all 3 tell us 3 different things, but the truth is a combination of all 3 things.
So Jess, we did that in later weeks. We did break up some of the hours, but in this case, in the first week, we actually have 2 individuals working on this. So if they split the work, is it not realistic that they could get the 20 hours done?
Yes, it's realistic, but then then my challenge to you is, why do you have a week duration?
Yeah,
So we could change that to 3 or 4 days?
Well, yeah, you can. So part of this exercise is to go through and say, okay, well, if you have 2 people, 20 hours, I mean, again, if I have 2 people, 20 hours, that's 10 hours over those 5 days, which is 2 hours per day for each of those individuals. Now, this goes back to the availability of the individual, the skills that you're going to have available to you. If you got people that you got more than 3 hours a day available to you, then the question is, why can't we shrink the duration? That would be a question. So yes, to answer your question, Julie, the answer is yes. Logically, yes, you could. But then the question is, if you do that, then you're going to actually speed up, you're going to move everything in. Unless there's a resource problem with whoever's performing step 1.1.1. Remember, this isn't, this is the plan, and the reality may be different, right? Hopefully it is different. Here, the plan is never, ever exact. If it is, then you got to question, why is that? But you're either going to, like I said, you're going to speed up on some things, slow down on others, right? So you're going to be, you know, again, speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, but it's about controlling the execution that you stick to that end date, so that end date doesn't move. Whether it moves too early, you get asked the question why. If it moves too far out, you get asked the question why. Because again, some projects getting done early isn't a good thing. It could cause other problems. So you need to ask those questions. It's all about asking the questions. But from a mathematical perspective, the way if you plug this into a Microsoft project, that's how it's going to calculate the hours. If you enter the effort hours in there and the resources, it's basically going to divide the days, total hours, divide the days. And if you have 2 people, it's going to assign 10 hours to each individual and take the 10 hours and divide it by 5. And that's how it's going to calculate the budget. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Krista, you good seeing what's happening?
Yeah, I think so.
Basically, we're now taking the work breakdown structure, which is vertical, and we're making it horizontal to create the schedule. And basically defining, so each one of these columns is a 5-week block, or sorry, a 5-day block, 1 week. And so what I told everyone is the project starts on Tuesday, September 15th, which means you only have 4 days this week to work on your project. Monday doesn't count. Quick question for you guys as I'm looking at yours. Week 2, you have a milestone, which is PB approval. And then does that drive 1.1.4 decide on performance metrics?
I mean, not necessarily, but it could.
Well, I'm saying there's a gap here. I don't see connection. So what triggers then scope work to be done and scope work to be done to create templates?
The PB approval would drive those.
Okay, so you should have, yeah, so get some arrows going.
Arrows. Okay.
I think you got arrows on everything else. The other thing to remember is if you want, you can go ahead and highlight your critical path by turning the colors of the Post-it notes red. And then that will give us a visual on your critical path. Since you guys are really the ones furthest through this, in whatever time you have left, you can also look at the accumulative consumption of the budget. In other words, you're going to spend $832 week 1. Week 2, you would add $832 plus $1456. So by the end of week 2, that's how much of your budget you should consume, and all the way through. And that's an indicator of where you should be of the consumption of your budget as you go through this project. I'm not asking you to put a chart together, but if you guys can do that, since you guys are further along than anyone else. And then I'll use you guys as an example, because we will be talking about tracking your budget.
So just kind of put the running total at
Yep.
the end of week
At the
2,
bottom.
the end of week 3.
Yep.
Budget,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Running total.
Okay.
All right.
Cool.
Any questions?
I don't think so.
All right, I'm gonna go check. Oh, let's see. I see some more people have joined. All right.
I think we've confused ourselves here. Maybe we haven't. Maybe I confused myself. So if the sticky in the prior column has work that carries into future columns,
Yes.
maybe it's a question for Guy too. How do you depict that on this to make sure you don't forget about it as you're tallying up future weeks?
Show them how.
I was assuming
Can you see that?
Write them out.
high tech, man, high tech.
Yeah, check.
I was assuming the arrow would carry across to the next.
You could do it that way. You could do it that way too. You could just totally those post-it notes in that week, and then carry the arrow out to the week that it goes out to.
Yeah, the problem
Oh,
is we've got items here that sort of stop. They're, I think, part of it is because we kind of brainstormed in
Not all of it carries over though.
different pieces, the total project.
Right.
So there's some items that probably more of this should connect together. I'm guessing that it does.
You probably
So
do.
like
You probably have more than need to.
Timelines says it's 8 weeks and 40 hours. Well, there's no arrow going forward to the next task. So it just kind of,
At the end, like this one doesn't
Yeah.
go that way.
Right.
Well, that's what I was saying at the start of the session a little bit. I think you guys have some arrows towards the back end of this that are not connecting all the way out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think around week 14, the arrows seem to stop, but we should have arrows that are somehow connected us out to the following weeks.
yeah, I missed a lot as I thought I was done with
Connecting the dots.
some of these.
Oh,
Yeah,
we're going back. We're going back.
looks like we're going to be going back in a minute.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
I'll go upstairs.
Okay. Let Bill in, please.
Bill's in.
Bill's in now?
He was.
Okay.
Since he didn't respond, it looked like it kicked him. Well, you're all going to get kicked out anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He came into my personal space.
Yeah, I saw that.
You want to file a grievance, Chewy?
It made me uncomfortable.
All right. It looks like you guys, we'll get through these. You guys are going to have some time to work on this. So don't worry too much.
Okay.
They're in good shape.
I felt like this exercise would have been great to use Excel with.
Yeah, with some tool.
All right. Everyone's back? See, do we have everyone? Where's Bill? Where's Josh? They dropped off again. All right, we got everybody now? That's what it looks like. All right. Let me see here. All right, we're going to continue. Any questions?
Just a statement, we're terrible at this.
Well, you weren't here on Friday, so I wouldn't say you're terrible. There's the piece that is needed from Friday that would have helped a lot. So I wouldn't worry too much about that at this point. I think we're going to have some time, just looking at the time right now, to allow you to go back and continue doing some work and then prepare for your final report out. And so we'll continue on and with the presentation portion of it. And then I'll turn you guys loose again to work on your project and then your final report out.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Everybody see the screen?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. All right, no questions. All right. Remember I said we had a lot of work to do, so look at that. We just finished our 7th step, kind of, but we need to go back and finish that. But we'll move on to the next piece, and like I said, I'll allow you some more time here before we're done to go back and do some more. So basically, what we've covered is basically the 7 steps in creating your schedule. This is the bulk of the work, and this is the bulk of the schedule, the bulk of the planning phase. Now that we completed this, we're ready to move on to the monitoring and update. So, you know, we've gone through, we've aligned our project objectives, we've defined a statement of work, we've developed a work breakdown structure. As far as the organizational structure, you've identified what you need as far as skills and resources. So the next step would be to set up what's called a project notebook. Regardless of size of project, you should create a notebook where you're going to track all the good, the bad, and the ugly, because remember, at the end of this, at the end of every project, we need to do a lessons learned. And if you don't have a notebook where you're tracking things, it's going to be very difficult to actually do that lessons learned. And trust me, we've had to come in at the end of projects where nothing's been written down, and people forget. So, and of course, then ensure that all the stakeholders, especially your sponsor or the client, have signed off on the plan, that they agree. And so having that report out and presenting the plan in detail and making sure that both the stakeholders and the sponsor / customer are fully understand what the plan is. So there are no surprises. So now that we start ready to move into the monitoring and execution phase or control phase, any updates going forward, make sure that at the end of the plan that your schedule becomes your baseline schedule. In other words, you're not going to be adjusting the dates on your original plan, but basically you're going to be overlapping. And if you use one of the softwares, as long as you mark it as a baseline, it will automatically do it for you. We want to make sure that the schedules are real, right? It's back to the reality check. One of the things we were talking about with Team 2 was that they had 2 people, 20 hours over 5 days. The reality is that that work could be done sooner than that. Okay, that may be the reality, but that's why you need to look at it and say, what is the reality? Is 5 days based on the current resources that have been assigned? Is that real? All right, that's fine. It may change later. That's okay. But again, is from releasing a baseline schedule, make sure that it's realistic. Allow for contingencies, hold regular progress meetings, and be clear. And the key word is honest communication on any schedule issues. Whether they're good, bad, or ugly, you gotta be honest about your communications on a project schedule. Any questions on that? Again, for the work that we still need to do, I'll give you some more time later this morning. So like I said, we're moving into now the execute and control. We've completed the plan. Now we're going to be looking, we're going to be in this loop because we're now in the execution phase. So we're going to be looking, we're going to be tracking, comparing actuals versus plan. We're going to be submitting reports. We're going to be evaluating the information we have, and we're going to be adjusting the plan accordingly. Okay, and we're just going to keep doing that until the project is completed. This is what we call the plan, do, check, act. We've done the plan. We're going into the do. We're going to be checking, and we're going to be acting or adjusting accordingly. And then we're going to plan again. So once we make the adjustments, we're back into that plan. And then we're going to do, check, act until the project is completed. So the key processes we're going to be performing during this phase is tracking and controlling. We're going to be doing the reporting, reviewing, and evaluating, and revisiting and adjusting the resource allocation, right? And again, this is typically referred to as the plan, do, check cycle. And we're just going to keep doing that until the project is complete. So some key areas that we need to look at, right, from a higher level is looking at the schedule. Is the project on time? And we're going to be looking at the costs. Are we tracking the costs? And is the project within the initial budget estimate? Those are the key things we're going to be looking at. We're going to peel the onion a little bit further and say, okay, there are very specific key control factors that we need to look at and stay on top of that, on top of. One is the scheduling, right? This is the time, the consumption of duration. We're going to have to stay on top of the consumption of duration. The second thing we need to look at is staffing. We're going to have to stay on top of the staffing because the staffing affects the effort hours. And we'll talk about each one of these, of what to look for in each one of these. And of course, the budgeting, the money portion. We're going to be looking at the consumption rate of the budget, right? Which is usually tied to the labor hours, which are staffing, but also the material costs or any resource or external resources that you're using, those costs also. So the first one that we would look at is going to be the timing, the schedule itself. We're going to compare the actual task with the project schedule. And we need to determine, are those tasks late? We need to determine the impact. Remember, we talked about critical path and the importance of watching critical path, because anything on the critical path, it's going to affect that end date. Now, there may be some activities and some tasks that may slip, but may not be on the critical path, and that may be okay, but you still have to evaluate to see what the impact is. We also need to determine the overall impact, right? If some of these slipped or some of them finish early, right? Because it's both ways. You need to be looking for both what slips or what moves in, and we need to be asking why. Because if something moves in, we just consumed the budget sooner than we expected. And we need to understand, what is that impact going to be? Now, for most of you that are doing internal projects, it may not be a big deal. On the other hand, if you're doing a project for external customers, there's typically what's called a schedule of values. In other words, that you're going to be compensated as a company for X on certain dates, or when certain tasks are completed, And if they're tied to dates and you finish something early, you're not going to be paid until that was originally scheduled to be completed. And so you have to look at that, because then it impacts your income or your revenue coming in. And so again, you have to look at those dates to see, again, if they're too early or too late. We need to understand why and what's the impact. Making adjustments to the schedule. Really, the only way you really affect the schedule is by either adjusting the effort associated, and that usually refers to staff. And so when we look at staffing, tracking staff, we need to look at, is staff not available for the work once it was scheduled? Again, the importance of going through and doing your final report out and sign off after planning is to make sure that all the parties involved, and if you're borrowing people that do not report to you as a project manager, those managers and those supervisors have to buy into it, because if they're pulling people off, that's going to impact the project. Okay? So things we look for: staff not available. On the other hand, the opposite, too much staff being used, right? All of a sudden, the supervisor might come in and say, well, I need you to get this done, so I'm going to throw 3 bodies at it so this task gets done sooner. Well, again, like I said, what is that impact? That might be fine for that department. It may not be fine for the project. The other thing that I've seen, that we've all seen, is the staff with the wrong skills. Often you identify, this is why it's important that you define clearly the skill requirements when you're identifying the resources, and the skill requirements to perform that work is extremely important. I have been part of organizations where they look at staff and they say, okay, well, you want the most expensive person who's also the most experienced, but I also need him on this other project or 2 other projects, so I'm going to send you someone that just came out of college, and they can do the work, but it may take 2, 3, 4 times as long, and they may be causing some mistakes along the way. So we've seen that happen a lot, right? The dollar amount might come down because now you have a lower cost individual. The problem may be is that now it's going to take longer, or if there's rework, it's going to slow down whatever work happens downstream. So we need to understand that. So as project managers, you have to look at the staff piece, because it impacts both the time and the quality of the work that's being performed when you have individuals with the wrong skills performing certain tasks. And then, of course, like I said earlier, if staff is being pulled off projects before they finish their work, that's going to impact the project. So staff tracking is one of the most important items you need to do as a project manager, is making sure that if the plan called for this number of resources and skill level and knowledge to perform the task, that is happening. Otherwise, if, again, there are company requirements say, sorry, you can't have this individual, or this individual gets sick, or this individual has an accident, or is not there, then obviously you're going to have to deal with it. But again, the people part is probably the most important part that impacts the timeline a lot more than anything else. The other one is resources. If you're actually hiring external resources, the availability of those external resources also becomes a big impact. On the money side, tracking the budget. Are you over budget by percent or dollar? Under budget by percent and dollar? Okay. Causes to this could be changes to people. Like I said, if all of a sudden I plan for a high dollar person, but bring in a low dollar person, well, from a financial perspective, that might be a big plus, but from a project timeline perspective, that's a negative, which in turn is going to add up in cost over time. And the same thing going the other way around, right? I planned for a low cost person to perform this task. All of a sudden, I got this person over here who's available, but he's a high cost person. Stick him in there, that's going to change the cost. Same thing with material, especially long-term projects. Long-term projects, the cost of material changes. Are you locking in the cost? So you need to understand resources, right? External resources, those costs may change. These are all things you need to look for from a project management of things that impact your budget. your numbers. Key performance indicators on a project. You really need all three of these to really understand where your project is at. So you need to understand duration, percent complete of duration. So let's give an example that I have a duration for a task that's 5 days, okay? In those 5 days, let's say we start on a Monday, it is now Thursday, I've consumed what percent? 80% of my duration has been consumed, but I had 10 hours over 5 days, which 2 hours a day, and I've only actually consumed 2 hours total, which is only 20%. So I'm at 90% duration or 80% duration complete. I'm at 20% duration effort hours complete, and my budget could be at 50% because I had an expensive person perform those 2 hours. What does that tell you? That tells you I really need to look into this because we're running out of time. We're going to be late, and there's a possibility I'm going to be over budget. So again, all three of these numbers tell you what's really happening. If you just look at one number, if you just look at duration, percent complete duration, I'm at 90% complete or 80% complete. That's great. It sounds like I'm on schedule, except I don't know how many effort hours have actually completed, and vice versa, right? So you need all three of these numbers to understand the performance of your project. And typically where we find the time portion is, or the duration hours, is by looking at your Gantt chart. So again, looking at this Gantt chart, main task 2. Now, again, if you establish your schedule with the baseline, what's going to happen now, you're going to actually see the percent complete. You see my original schedule versus my actual. And you can see on this schedule, the planned date shows, the duration shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, and it actually took 7 weeks, which means that the next task starts late, and then that gets pushed out. And you can see the missed dates here. Same thing here. Now all of a sudden you can start see it starts shifting, it's impacting everything else. So now my completion date is way out here on 5/13, way out here, 5/13, when it was supposed to be completed the week of May 5th. So this is one way, but make sure that your baseline schedule, that you save your files, but Microsoft projects in particular, if you don't save your file as a baseline, it's not going to track this. So again, keep that, make sure you have a baseline, you're tracking that. On a budget, one of the things I've asked you to do with the work you're doing is identify what it's costing you on a weekly basis. So you basically have the consumption of your budget over the periods, right? The number of time durations that you have or time periods that you have. Dollars on one side, very simple, nothing very complicated. And you're tracking. This is the plan. This is my actual spending. Here, I'm sure Brad's going to be unhappy because you're over budget. Over here, Brad's going to be very happy because you're under budget. Over here, he is not going to be happy at all, right? So we need to understand. And again, this picture alone doesn't tell the whole story. It just tells you the story around the dollar portion. It doesn't tell me the story around the effort hours and the work completion. And it doesn't tell me about the durations. And it could be that we're over budget because we consumed, usually when I see this, it's because of the duration piece, we consume most of the duration, and at the end of the project, we just had to get the project done, so whatever it takes to get it done. And so that's kind of an indicator what this says. But again, is making sure you're able to have a tool that tracks the budget over time your time periods to see where you are, the consumption. And again, these are minimum indicators. There are other indicators such as, we can get it into a lot of different ones, but these three are the primary ones you should have as a minimum. So the other part of the execution and control is then conducting status meetings, publishing reports. I would recommend keeping the size of reports down to a minimum. What we recommend is that you use your project charter and update the project charter, create multiple revisions of it to update the status of the project. You need to manage issues as a project team. You need to update the plan accordingly. You need to execute a quality assurance plan, and that quality assurance plan is ensuring the workmanship on the project. And if there's going to be training, right, make sure you're managing the training, especially if you're doing an internal project, which usually relates to equipment or new systems, is managing that training, that it's taking place, just what we call just-in-time learning or just-in-time training. That you don't train too far ahead of time, that before you actually turn the equipment on or turn on a new system, that people forget. And manage the team. As a project manager, manage your team and manage your customer and your sponsor. It's important that you continue to develop good communications with your customer or your sponsor. Ensure there's timely participation. Again, I always recommend have your supervisors, managers participate in the sessions that you have with your team, so there's an understanding of what's going on and how it's being done. When most people hate, and I can tell you as when I was a manager and when I was in management, is what I hated is when all of a sudden he had this surprise, hate surprises. And then develop trust and confidence, both ways, with your team and with your sponsor and your leadership and customer. So an area to be watching for, and that is scope creep. One of the biggest challenges on any project is scope creep. And if you don't have a clear scope and a clear statement of work up front, this is going to happen. And this is going to affect everything from duration, effort hours, and your budget. So causes and sources of scope creep. Scope creep occurs when there's a change of team players or where there's a change either as a sponsor or if you're working with the customer, when your primary contact within the customer becomes a different person. All of a sudden, they have a whole different view or interpretation of what the scope of the work is. And so that's really important to understand, and why it's so important that you have a clear scope of work as well as statement of work, because people change their minds. Budget instability, right? It's another issue. If you don't secure and get committed the funds up front, and it's one of those, well, if you're going to be constantly estimating as the project is progressing, is you never have a stable budget, and things can come up and say, sorry, the funds aren't there. I mean, that could happen anyway, but it happens more often when there isn't a stable budget or a planned budget. Technology, if you're incorporating technology as part of your project, technology changes rather quickly. And so you have to be conscious of that, because again, as people change, all of a sudden they want the latest and greatest technology. And so be conscious of that. Changing competitive environment. So that's the external world, right? So understand the competition out there. So they may be changing things. The other thing is the economy. I mean, obviously, a lot of things have changed in the last 6 months. So we need to be aware of all those things because all those things affect the scope of work and the statement of work. But one of the biggest changes that I see, or the biggest impacts that we've seen, is the internal constant indecision that takes place with projects. When it comes especially to technology or construction type, internal construction work, is when you have lots of parties involved, not getting agreement early on the project. And so that becomes extremely critical. Again, back to scope of work. So to manage scope creep, you have to have an effective change management process or procedure. You must document your change management process, okay? And especially your internal. We've worked with clients who have customers and they're always blaming the customer for changes, right? It's always the customer, it's always the customer. But we have data that shows 60% of the changes are driven internally, not externally. Not to say that the customer is not going to make changes or the external world is not going to make changes, they are. But what we have found is 60% of the changes come internally because of personal preferences of individuals that are working on the project. If scope isn't communicated and statement of work isn't communicated clearly, people are going to start changing things. And so this is probably one of the biggest challenges a project manager has, is making sure that people stay on course, especially if you're dealing with technical people, engineers in particular, because nothing is ever good enough. And so at some point, there has to be good enough. And it's the project manager that's going to have to make sure, and the project team has to make sure that they make that call. So you need to have a good change control process. So basic objectives of a change control process is ensuring that you have a way. You don't want to discourage changes because some changes are real good, some changes are just unreasonable. And so you need a way to screen those changes. And so you need to come up with a change request process. You also need to keep track of what gets accepted. You need to define the criteria of what you're going to accept and what you're not going to accept ahead of time. You need to come up with that criteria. You need to track what you have agreed to and track what you haven't agreed to. You need to update if you accept changes. You need to review the plan and understand the impact. And if you have to adjust the plan or develop a new portion of the plan, not start from new, or come up with a new process, you'll need to do that. Again, this is probably one of the biggest areas, biggest challenges that any project manager has, is these last minute changes that occur. And again, it usually isn't being driven by the outside world as much as it is being driven from within the organization. So what if the project falls behind schedule? So there's always 4 options for you. And the first option is look at your activities that have slack or float and adjust those. Okay? As long as those tasks do not impact the last delivery date or the end date of the project. Add more resources, which is going to impact your budget. All right, so basically what you're going to end up doing is either looking at working overtime, working weekends, adding more people, typically whatever it takes. Usually I can tell you that on projects, if there's an end date and it's committed to a customer as an end date, it's the last thing that's going to change, and usually everything in front of it, which typically then impacts costs because it impacts the effort hours needed to complete that project. The other thing is to look at adjusting and cutting the scope of work. So going back and sitting down with the customer and said, well, look, you had these additional change orders. These were not part. we can achieve what you wanted originally. And so unless you're willing to change the end date, then, you're going to have to go back and negotiate. But the absolute last thing you ever do is change the end date of a project. And early on, I gave you the example of the project I was working on in Portland. And that one, there was no choice. I mean, the tunnel was taking an extra year to complete. So the end date we had no choice but to change the end date. And so that's the last thing you ever do. You do everything else before you get to changing the end date. Questions? You guys are pretty quiet today.
I got a comment. So one of the things that we run into, and you're measuring all three, the timeline, the duration, and the budget.
Right.
And we get a lot of excuses of, well, it's a timing issue. So it's important to look at all three, because if you've spent more money than you should have so far, or less for that matter, you want to make sure that your percent complete matches that.
Absolutely. And that's why you have to look at all three, because if you just look at the dollar portion, it's not going to give you what's happening on the effort or time side. Again, because there's too many other factors that could impact the dollar side. Same thing with the effort hours, right? And again, because I got to go back and look at the staff. Do I have the right skills? And so you have to look at all three to understand, which means monitoring. So let's take the project size, not the one you guys are working on as a team, but some of these others that I'm going to use Team 3's, which is the parking lot, paving the parking lot. And so you have to look at all three. Now, in their case, the dollar piece would probably be a bigger one because they're outsourcing the work. So you're not going to necessarily see the effort hours. So you're going to look at duration, and you're going to see percent complete of work, big chunks of work versus the individual hours being consumed, which may be reflected in the dollar piece depending on how they structure their contract. But you have to look at all three of those to have a good understanding and a good picture to see where your project's at. Too often, we have walked into organizations where they use the software, and this is one of my, again, why I'm critical of some of the software. The software only reports on the Gantt chart is percent complete of duration. It does not show you effort hours. It does not show you budget. Yes, you can show a column for effort hours and a column for dollars, but it does not give you, just by looking at the numbers themselves, does not give you an indication until you actually overlap all three of those to see where you are. And so it's important that all three are measured, all three are reported, and you start asking questions. If one's ahead and one's behind, why is that? Because it may be hiding something.
One other thing we do that I think is helpful is that you don't change the budget. Once the budget is set, you don't change the budget. But as we go through, we have a proposed finish cost. In other words, so let's say you're under budget. You can project out when you finish the project what the final costs are going to be based on the remaining budget spend. And that way you can move the timing forward or backwards. So let's say you say, okay, we're going to spend $10,000 in the budget says we're going to spend $10,000 in January. Well, and we already paid the bill in December. So we don't want to add, so the budget shows we're over budget because we paid early.
Right.
Technically. But we don't want to add another $10,000 in January because we already spent it. So we have to compensate for that in the final proposed, so that we're still on budget at the final.
Correct.
Final deal. Or if we've spent 10,000, we still expect another 10,000 in January, then we're going to be over budget.
Over budget, correct.
So you can see, you can kind of track. It's not just a track to budget; it's a track to final project costs.
Right. It's what we call final project projections. And so the final projection, you got to be looking at that final projection and your current costs. So typically, again, depending on how long your projects are, typically at the minimum on a monthly basis, two numbers you should be asking your project manager. Where are you today and what's your projected cost at the end of the project?
It's
And
not
so,
just engineers that want to be good enough, it's accountants as well.
yes, that too. So, like I said before, the two that we always run into with challenges are actually there's three. It's the engineers, it's the accounting folks, and it's also the sales guys. So, so you need to, again, but those are the three minimum numbers from a project perspective, or the three performance indicators you need to look at. And you have to look at all three together, not one individually, to give you a good understanding of where your project's at. Again, too often we see people only looking strictly at budget or strictly at duration. And rarely do we see people look at hours, and they should be looking at hours as well. Because again, all three of those give you a good understanding of where the work is done. To me, the biggest one is, where are we with the work? Are we completed with the work? And if we're not, that's where the focus should be. And duration is the second most important, and then the budget, because if you focus on the effort hours, your budget should stay aligned. And so, but you need all three to give you a good understanding of how your project is doing. Other questions, other comments? That's good, Bill. That's part of, do you guys have an internal policy or process for managing your projects?
Unwritten. It's not a formal.
Okay.
That's why we're here.
Okay. So a suggestion to have some of those in place. That way, every project should be following the same thing, not dependent on the individual to remember what they did last time. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a little break at this point before we move on to the next piece. So it is 9:19. Everybody back at 9:30. And then we'll move on to the next session, or next piece.